How's it going, everyone? The United States imposed tariffs on a number of countries, and the equation on the screen here has been posted by the Office of the United States Trade Representative and has been making its way around the internet as a calculation used to determine which tariffs to apply onto which country. So we're going to go through this equation. I'm going to explain what all of the symbols mean, how the equation works, what it calculates, and finally we'll discuss where this equation even comes from, why this equation and not something else instead. Now, it's important to understand that this equation does not give the tariff rate that was applied to each country. Rather, this equation gives the tariff rate that theoretically, in the opinion of the White House, would result in a decrease of imports from a country such that the imports equals the exports that the United States exports to that country. In other words, the tariff rate that theoretically would bring the trade balance to zero, right? And we have that statement here. The reciprocal tariff that results in a bilateral trade balance of zero satisfies the following equation. So this calculation was used to determine which tariff rate to apply, although the applied tariff rate may have been different than what this equation actually yields. My understanding is that for most countries that tariffs were applied to, the tariff rate was 10%. For countries where this calculation yielded a larger value, half of what this calculation yielded, approximately half, is what was applied. And for some countries, no additional tariffs were applied at all. For example, countries with a lot of sanctions on them, such that additional tariffs wouldn't really have a significant effect. Those countries didn't have additional tariffs put onto them. Canada, Mexico, which already have tariffs on them due to other disputes or negotiations going on with the United States, they did not have additional tariffs placed onto them either. So let's get into this calculation. Okay, the first symbol we see here, this triangle, this symbol is called delta, and in mathematics it means a difference or a change of something. A change of what? Well, that's what the next symbol tells us. This is tau, which is the lowercase Greek t. It has a subscript I, but we're going to talk about those subscripts later on. So tau here represents the tariff rate, T for tariffs, right? So delta tau is the change in tariff rate, right? The change in tariff rate equals something, right? The something involves X, which is the exports from the United States to a country. M is the imports from that country into the United States. Easy to remember. X for exports, M for imports. Okay, now the situations that concern the United States is where imports, M, is greater than exports. Okay, the White House believes that in that situation, either the country should be exporting more, either the United States should be exporting more goods to that country, or imports from that country should decrease because Americans can buy those goods from the United States as well, and spending that money on companies that are based in the United States, right? The White House is of the opinion that if imports from a country are greater than exports to that country, well, then there's some mechanisms resulting in interfering with the United States exporting to that country, and the United States is not happy with that. So for the purpose of looking at this equation, we're assuming that M is bigger than X. Therefore, this numerator is a negative number because you're taking a smaller amount of exports and subtracting a larger amount of imports. So in the denominator, we have M again, which is imports, and then we have these two other values. This one that kind of looks like an E is called epsilon, and it represents the proportional change in simple terms. Okay, this represents the proportional change in imports as a result of a change in import prices, and this is a negative value. because if import prices go up, imports go down. And if import prices go down, imports go up. Okay, so epsilon is negative. Then we have this symbol here, which is like a loop with a line through it. This is the Greek F. It's called phi. And this symbol represents the proportional change in import prices as a result of a change in tariff rate. Okay, and this is a positive value, right? If tariff rates go up, then import prices go up because tariffs are a tax on imports, right? It's more expensive to import something if there's a higher tariff. And if tariffs go down, then import prices go down, right? So phi is a positive value. Now, to understand what this equation does, we are going to go to the whiteboard and we'll actually rewrite this equation in a way that's a bit simpler to understand. So let's do that. Okay, here's the same equation up here. Now you'll notice that some of these values have a subscript I next to them. Those values with a subscript I are values that are different for different countries. Okay, so the change in tariff rate, the exports to a country, the imports from a country, that's different for different countries. Whereas epsilon and phi, they're the same for all countries. Okay, there's no subscript I there. These values, right, you'll see same thing here. These little stars, by the way, they mean multiply, okay, in the denominator. Okay, so epsilon times phi times imports. Okay, these values, epsilon and phi, these are values that theoretically are believed to represent the proportional rates of change that they represent. And there's different opinions as to what these values are, but the values used by the White House is that epsilon is -4 and phi is 0.25. Okay, so again, epsilon is negative, right? Because prices going up, import prices going up means less imports, right? And 4 tells us that, well, the amount of imports is actually quite sensitive to import prices, right? Which makes sense. Now, phi being 0.25, rather close to 0, tells us that import prices are not too sensitive to a change in tariffs. Okay, so if you change tariffs, the import prices will be affected, but not too much. But what epsilon tells us that even a small effect on import prices can have a significant effect on the amount of imports. Now, what's convenient is that epsilon times phi is -4 times 0.25, which is -1. And that simplifies our equation quite a bit. So let's rewrite it, taking that into consideration. We then have that delta tau sub I equals xi minus mi divided by negative mi, right? Because that epsilon phi, that's just equal to -1. And we can simplify this further. We can multiply top and bottom by -1, which will make the xi negative. It will make the mi on top positive, and the bottom becomes positive. Okay, so this equation is much easier to look at and understand what's going on, or this form of the equation. On the top, we have the amount of imports minus the amount of exports. Okay, this is from the perspective of the United States, right? So imports to the United States from a country minus exports from the United States to that country. And we're assuming that M is bigger than X. So on the top, we have the trade deficit, right? Because imports is greater than exports. And on the bottom, we have the total amount of imports, right? So what this equation is, it is the trade deficit as a proportion of total imports. Okay, so if trade deficit is 50% of total imports, well then the change in tariff rate would be 50%. If the trade deficit is 10% of total imports, well then the change in tariff rate would be 10%. If the trade deficit is 90% of total imports, well then the change in tariff rate would be 90%, and so on. Okay. Another way we can write this equation, which might be easier to think about, is we break it up into two separate fractions. And then we see that the mi's cancel out here, and we just get 1 minus xi over mi. Okay, this might be easier to look at because mi appears only once. Okay, so if we have xi is approximately equal to mi, right? So exports and imports are about at the same, right? Well, then you have delta tau I equals 1 minus 1, right? Because if xi and mi are approximately equal to each other, you're dividing something by itself, which is equal to 1, right? 1 minus 1 is 0, and then you have no change in tariff rate, okay? Imports and exports balance each other, no need to change the tariff rate. Now, if you have the exports much, much smaller than the imports, okay, or way more imports than exports, okay, then you have xi over mi is a small number divided by a much bigger number, so that's approximately 0, right? And so your delta tau I is approximately 1 minus 0, which is 1, okay? Or in percent terms, that would be 100%, right? So in this situation where a country is importing, where the United States is importing much more from the country than it's exporting to that country, well, then you get a tariff rate closer to 100%, and realistically, it'll be somewhere in between, right? So the bigger imports are with respect to exports, the larger this change in tariff rate is. Okay, so now we ask the question, well, why this equation? Okay, why not some other equation? Why is it called a reciprocal tariff if it's based on the trade deficit, for example? Okay, and to answer all that, we're going to get into where this equation even comes from. Okay, so what concerns the United States is if you have imports greater than exports. Okay, if the United States is buying more from a country than what it is selling to that country. Okay, there's two reasons why that concerns the White House. One reason is they feel, well, why are Americans buying from other countries when we could be buying from American-based companies instead, creating revenue and jobs for Americans? The other thing that's concerning the United States is, well, if American exports are lower than imports from a particular country, then that could be a sign of this country using some sort of mechanisms to reduce American exports to that country, which reduces opportunities for American companies, right? So how America would want to balance this situation is to make MI equal to XI, right? Now, by imposing tariffs, they're making it more expensive for Americans to import from other countries, which would incentivize Americans to import less and purchase American products more, right? So what that would do is it would bring M down, right? It reduces imports. That's what tariffs directly do. They reduce imports, right? Because it's a tax on imports. Now, an indirect effect could be, well, once tariffs are placed onto a country or are threatened onto a country, the country would say, well, hey, let's not do this. Let's negotiate something instead such that American companies will be able to export to that country more easily, which would actually bring X up. Okay, so you could either bring X up or you could bring M down, two different ways in order to achieve this kind of trade balance. All right, so the question then is, which tariff rate would be needed to bring down M enough to create that balance? Okay, and to answer that, we have to say, well, how much does M have to be brought down? Okay, well, the change in M, okay, delta M, would have to be equal to Xi minus Mi. Okay, whatever that trade imbalance is, whatever the difference between exports and imports is, that is the change in imports that we're trying to calculate, or that we're trying to find the tariff rate that would result in that particular change in imports. And this is a negative value, right? This is a negative change because the tariff would bring the imports down, and M is bigger than X, right? So this is a negative value. So what would that change, what change in tariff rate would result in such a change in imports? Well, whatever that change in tariff rate is, okay, whatever that delta tau I is, okay, if we multiply that by phi, which is the proportional change in import prices as a result of a change in tariff rate, and we multiply that by epsilon, which is the proportional change in imports as a result of a change in import prices, then we get the proportional change in imports. And then we multiply that by the actual amount of imports that exists, and then we get the change in imports that needs to happen. And that change in imports is again the difference between exports and imports. Now we rearrange this equation to solve for tau I, and what do we get? Xi minus Mi divided by epsilon phi Mi. We get the very equation that was presented by the Office of the United States Trade Representative. Now, this whole article here explains all of this that I'm talking about and a bit more. It's a pretty quick and interesting read if you'd like to, and I'll put the link to this in the description of the video. That said, some of the wording is a bit complicated, and that's what this video is here to clear up. Now, final question, why is it called a reciprocal tariff, which makes it sound like it's a response to tariffs? Okay, well, that comes down to the question of, well, why is there even a difference between exports and imports? And the answer is, well, there must be some mechanism responsible for decreasing American exports to a country such that those exports are less than the imports coming from that country. Now, what could that mechanism be? Well, it could be tariffs, okay? The thing is, when tariffs are applied, for example, someone applies tariffs onto the United States, they have different tariff rates applied to different goods, different tariff rates that apply in different situations. Plus, there could be other mechanisms other than tariffs that have a similar effect as tariffs, and that similar effect would be reducing American exports to a country. So, how does one take all of these different mechanisms and take the combined effect of all of these mechanisms and imagine what kind of, both the tariffs and the non-tariffs, all those mechanisms, their combined effect, okay? And if the United States wants to respond to that entire phenomena with a single tariff rate change, okay, to counter that phenomena, to counter the effect of those mechanisms, what would that tariff rate have to be? Okay, and the answer is given in this equation, theoretically, right? So that's where this equation comes from. Now again, the actual tariff increase is not what this equation yields, but this equation was used to determine what that tariff increase is. Again, as I understand, for most countries that had a tariff increase, it was just a flat rate of 10%. For countries where this equation yielded a relatively larger value, the increase was half of what this equation yields, because making the increase exactly what this equation yields would be very high numbers, which would be quite a strong shock to the system. So that's where this equation comes from, what it represents, how it's used, why it's called a reciprocal tariff, right? Because it's a tariff used to respond to whatever tariff-like mechanisms may exist towards the United States. So I hope you enjoyed that and it was informative, and until next time.